All right, guys. So now we'll move on to chapter 5, correlation and regression. Okay. So under this particular topic, the first thing that you're going to learn is about scatter diagrams. Okay. So I believe you might have a slight idea about what are scatter diagrams, right? So bivariate data that are data which have pairs of values for two variables. Obviously, we know about these, right? So most of the data, when you draw graphs with two variables. Okay. So you can represent bivariate data. So basically, bivariate means there are two variables, x and y. Okay. You can represent bivariate data on a scatter diagram. This scatter diagram shows the results from an experiment on how the breath rate affects pulse rate. Okay, so they are saying how the breath rate, so if the breaths per minute, so when that increases, I think you can kind of like, they have kind of taken a survey. Okay, and you can see how the scatter diagram goes. Now, guys, you need to understand when it comes to real life data. Okay, when it comes to real life data and modeling with real life, when you do a survey and collect some information, so basically, the plots or the points you get will not always perfectly follow a straight line. That doesn't work out. So, for example, in this scatter diagram, you can see how the points are going on, right? So it doesn't follow a perfect straight line, but I think you can see some sort of pattern here, right? Because you can kind of see according to this pattern, as the breath per minute increases, I think you can kind of see like the pulse rate is also increasing, right? It kind of, it looks like it follows that pattern because you can see as the breaths per minute increase, this pulse rate is kind of increasing. It shows a pattern, right? But not exactly linear, not 100% linear line, not a full straight line, but it kind of goes in a pattern, right, guys? So this is how it works in real life data. So scatter diagrams are what you normally have to work with when you work with data. Okay, so it's the simplest diagram that you have. Okay, so scatter diagram is the simplest diagram we have. So they say here, so they say each cross represents a data point. You understand, right? Every single cross represents a data point. So maybe it's one person that you have surveyed. Every cross represents an individual person. So this person had a breath rate of 32 breaths per minute and a pulse rate of 89 beats per minute. So, okay, so this person, they're saying this person had a breath rate of 32 and a pulse rate of 89. So basically, they have done like that for everyone. Okay, so the next thing, the researcher could control this variable. Okay, the researcher, now they are saying the breaths per minute, the researcher could control this variable. It is called the independent or explanatory variable. It is always plotted on the horizontal axis. I think you guys already know about this, right? The independent variable is always plotted on the x-axis. So the independent variable is the one that we control. Okay, so independent variable is the one that we control. We can set it as we want, and then according to that variable, we can check the pulse rate. So pulse rate is kind of like the response. So we say that is the response according to these particular breaths per minute. What is the response? So for 20 breaths per minute, what's the response? For 25 breaths per minute, what's the response? For 30 breaths per minute, what's the response? Do you get it? The researcher measured this variable, this variable, the pulse rate is the one that he measured. Okay. So it is called the dependent or the response variables. That's really important. So when you're doing an experiment, you need to always know what's your independent variable and what's your dependent. So independent is the one that you set the way you want. And then according to that, according to the independent variable, how does the other variable react? Okay. How does it give the answer? So that's the dependent variable, or more commonly known as response variable. So guys, you need to get used to this word. Explanatory variable is the x variable, response variable is the y variable. I think it's easy to remember because explanatory variable has, it has the x letter here, right? So remember it in that way. So that's how that's the easiest way to remember. So explanatory variable has x here, so immediately it's the x-axis. Okay, so it's the x-axis, and that's the independent. Always x-axis is independent, right? You guys know that. Y-axis is always the dependent. So dependent variable is what we call as a response variable. Okay, so basically the y variable. So that's number one. Okay, so then the next thing they say is the two different variables in a set of bivariate data are often related. Okay, so basically most of the time when you are drawing these kind of scatter diagram, what's the point of drawing the scatter diagram? Why are we drawing it? The reason we are drawing it is we want to see whether there is some sort of a relationship. Is there some sort of a relationship between these two data? Okay, so these are how we do things in real life. Like, you have two variables and you want to see, are these two things related? So they say here, So correlation. So this is another important word. Okay, so this is a new word you learn. Correlation describes the nature of the linear relationship between two variables. Okay, so don't worry about the big words. They are really easy. When it comes to a point, you'll find that it's really easy. So correlation, what does correlation do? It describes the nature of the relationship. Now look at this. So they have given you like, 5 graphs here. And they're asking you to describe the correlation. Okay, so, okay. All right, so we'll look at the first graph. Guys, can you see how the pattern goes? I think you can see the crosses. Do you see how it goes? You can see that it is following a particular line, kind of like a downward trend. Can you see there's a downward trend, right? In the first graph that we did here, there was an upward trend. So this is the downward trend. And can you see the word they describe here? They say here there is a strong negative correlation. Okay, so why do they say negative correlation? Negative means because the relationship is going the other way. What do you mean by that? You can see when the x variable is increasing, what happens to the y variable? When the x variable increases, the y variable is decreasing. Can you see that? As x increases, y decreases. So that's why they say negative correlation. All right, guys. So remember, so I will, so you need to get it into your head. Then what is positive correlation? What's negative? So basically, positive correlation is when you have a positive gradient, right, guys? So a positive correlation means your graph is trending upward. Are you with me? Your graph is trending upward. Okay, so negative correlation means your graph is trending downwards. Right, guys, are you with me? Your graph is trending downwards. Okay, so this is the positive correlation, negative. So you need to understand in positive correlation what happens when x increases. When x increases, y also increases. Right, guys? Can you see when one variable is increasing, the other one is also increasing. In negative correlation, what happens? When x increases, guys, can you see when the x values are increasing, what happens to the y values? You can see at every single point when the x values are increasing, the y values are going down. Can you guys see? The y values decrease. Right, so you can see from every single point to point, the y value is decreasing because I'm going through each of these points with respect to x. So you can see it's going down. The y variable value keeps going down. Right, guys? Is that clear? So this is what we mean by negative correlation, right? So I think you can now go through these graphs. So they say here, so by the way, you can now identify whether it's positive correlation or negative, right, guys? So this first one is negative because the graph is trending down. What about this one? What about the second one? So guys, over here, so the first graph, you can see it's a negative gradient. There's a downward trend. This one also, you can see there is a kind of downward trend, right? Okay, you can see that if the points are going down, so maybe not as closely as this one. The points over in this graph, they are lying very close to each other, very close to a straight line, right? So over here, there is a downward trend, but you can see the straight line is not as obvious as this one. So the points are a little bit more dispersed. And if you look at the third one, I think you can see this third one is kind of confusing because we are really not sure whether it's a downward or upward because it's not quite clear, right? So it's not quite clear. So in these kinds of cases, they say there is zero correlation, or like the correlation is almost close to zero. Like there is no correlation, or in other words, there is no relationship. Do you get it? So no correlation means there's no relationship. These two variables are not depending on each other. Like there is absolutely no, there's nothing in between them. So one person doesn't affect the other. That's why you get a graph like this. Okay. And this one you can see the graph is having an upward trend. Can you see over here? It's kind of clear to us. The graph is having an upward trend. So it's a positive correlation. In this one also, it's very clear to us. The graph is having an upward trend. It's positive correlation. But you can see, guys, over here, they also use these words strong, positive, weak, positive. Do you see those words? They use the word strong and weak. Okay, what do you mean by strong and weak? So a strong correlation means the points are lying quite close to a straight line. If they are lying in such a way so that they are making that you can like see the straight line, then it's a strong correlation, right, guys? So over here when you compare the two negative correlation graphs, I think you can see the first graph shows a very it goes quite close to a straight line. Can you see? While the second graph, the straight, all the points, I mean, you can see if you try to draw a straight line, you can't draw the straight line to go through all these points, right? But over here, if you try to draw a straight line, I think the straight line will go through most of the points. Do you see? If you try to draw a straight line, it will go through most of these points. But over here, if you try to draw a line, you won't be able to get everyone onto that line. Do you see? That's why they say strong and weak. So strong, the more points you can get on the line, it's a stronger correlation, right? So here, it's a weak negative correlation. This is, and that's how they use those words. So over here, even for the positive also, we can say the same thing. Can you see? So over here, the points are more dispersed. Can you see? And over here, the points are more fitted towards a straight line. So when the points are more fitted towards a straight line, that's a strong correlation. So in this case, it's strong and it's a positive correlation. But over here, you can see a positive correlation, but the points are not as good as this. So, it's more dispersed, right? More scattered. So this is a weak positive correlation. So this is how correlation works. Basically, it tells you how well the two variables are related to each other. Right, guys? Okay. All right, guys. So I just want to, explain this simple example. Okay, so it's really easy because in the exercise also you have these questions, and I really don't want to take too much time over these kinds of small stuff. Okay, so just look at what they're saying here. In the study of a city, the population density in people per hectare and the distance from the city center in kilometer was investigated by picking a number of sample areas with the following results. Can you see what they are doing? So they are basically looking at the people per hectare, means actually the word is population density. So they want to see how the population density is going to change with the distance from the city center. So from the city center, as you move further and further away, what happened to the population? So they want to see whether there's a relationship between the distance to the city center and the population density. Do you understand what's going on? They're doing this survey. So they have done the survey and this is the data. They have said when the distance to the city center is 0.6 kilometers, the population density is 50. And for distance 3.8, I think you can see the distance and the population density is given. I think you can see it's kind of not rearranged, right? Because you can see, I can see the data values, these values are not exactly in order. So if you want, you can rearrange, but guys, be careful. Rearranging means that you should understand that these both of them are together. Okay, so rearranging doesn't mean that you write the smallest to largest here and smallest to largest here. No. Okay, so if you're rearranging, the entire 0.650 will move together. Do you get it? Okay, so over here the smallest is 0.650. Next one probably 0.9 and 38. Do you get it? So don't move it individually because the x and y are moving together. All right, guys. So basically, what you need to do here is they're asking you draw a scatter diagram to represent these data. So how do you draw a scatter diagram? Basically, I believe you can identify your dependent and independent variable, right? You need to be able to identify who is the independent, who is the explanatory, basically, in other words, and who is the y variable or the dependent or the response variable, right? Okay, so how do you identify who is dependent and who is independent? So what can we change and what is the output, who is the output? I believe you can understand that the distance is what we can measure, right? So distance is what we measure, and according to the distance, we check the response. According to the distance, the response is the population density, right? So according to the distance that we measure, we are checking the output. The output of our experiment is the population density. The population density should be your y variable, the dependent, and the independent one is the distance, right, guys? So that's how it works. So it's very important that you know how to identify who is the dependent and independent. So then, and then you draw the scatter diagram. So you guys can see that it's done here on this graph. So they have name, distance. So they've taken the axis, name the axis, and every single point is marked here. So distance 0.6, 50. I think you can see this is the first point. Can you see? So the first point corresponds to this. Can you see 3.8, 22 is over here. 3.8, 22 is this guy. Can you see? 3.8, 22, this one. Do you see? So you guys can, it's really simple. It's a very simple graph here. The next point, just to show you, 2.4, 1 point was the 2.4, 14. So that's this one. Can you guys see? I think it's pretty clear how the graph is drawn, right? You know how to mark coordinates on a coordinate axis. This is pretty much simple, I believe, right? just to mark the coordinates, and every single point here is marked through a cross. Can you see? So all these points, they have marked it through a cross. A very simple thing to do here, right, guys? So I hope you understand how the rest of the things come, how the rest of the process come. That's fine, right? Okay, so then we draw the scatter diagram. So the scatter diagram is going to give us an idea of how this, of the behavior, or basically it shows us whether there is actually a relationship between the two variables or not. So when you look at this scatter diagram, what do you think? Do you think there is some sort of relationship, or is there no relationship? What do you think of this one? Okay, so guys, you can see here by just going through this scatter diagram, it shows you a kind of pattern, right? So you can see that's kind of like a downward trend. So it's pretty much obvious. So as the distance is increasing, I think we can see the population density is going down, right? So you can kind of see like there is a correlation. Okay, so they are saying describe the correlation between the distance and the population density. So you have to describe it. So give it in words. So basically, um, but what kind of correlation do we have here? So do we have a positive correlation or a negative correlation? You also should say whether it is a weak positive, or I mean whether it's weak or strong. So very clearly you can see there's a downward trend. Therefore, it should be a downward trend means correlation is negative, right, guys? Downward trend means correlation is negative. And if you check how the points are behaving, I think you can see that most of the points will not go through a straight line because they are not very fitting close to a straight line, right? They are going down, but not so closely fitting to a straight line. So therefore, there is a weak negative correlation, right, guys? You understand how both of these words come, right? Weak comes because of the way the points are scattered, and negative comes because there's a downward trend, right, guys? So then that's how it's done. And then they say interpret your answer to part B. So interpret means you have to describe it. So when there is a weak negative means what's happening. So that's exactly what I was saying a few moments ago, right? So you can see as the distance is increasing, because when the variable is increasing, the y variable is decreasing, right, guys? So that's the meaning of negative. So you can say, so explain it. So you can say as the distance from the city center increases, the population density is decreasing. So something like that. So that's the interpretation that you are expected to give, right, guys? So you can clearly see there is a relationship. There is a weak negative relationship, weak negative correlation. The word you should use is correlation, and therefore the population density is decreasing when the distance from the city center increases, right, guys? So this is a very kind of like a basic assessment that you can do. All right, guys. So we'll move on to exercise 5A. So it's these are really simple exercises, right? Okay. So they say here in the first one, a lab technician researched the effectiveness of a herbal hair growth supplement. 7 people recorded their hair growth, and this was compared with the length of time they had been using the supplement. A scatter diagram was drawn to represent the data. So can you see the time they've been using the supplement and the hair growth? So they have given you the scatter diagram, and they're asking describe the type of correlation shown by the scatter diagram and to interpret the correlation in the context of the in context means you have to definitely describe it in terms of these variables. All right, so I believe you can do this easily, right? So just give an attempt. All right, so what we answer here, describe the type of correlation shown by the scatter diagram. So I think you can clearly see there is an upward trend, right? So there's an upward trend, and definitely this is what correlation you can say. There is a positive correlation, right? So you have a positive correlation, and actually weak or strong. To be honest, actually, for this to measure weak or strong correlation, you will actually be learning how to do some numerical work. Okay, because actually you can see over here, to say whether I mean, you will learn a numerical scale to consider this weak or strong to be actually okay in the next part. So basically, one of the main things you have to say here is very clearly you can see there is a positive correlation. Okay. That's definitely a positive correlation. And then interpret the correlation in context. So what do you see here? So in context means you have to explain them in the basically by using the variables they've given in the question. So you have to say when the time you can say there is time using supplement. So you can basically say right. So the longer the time using the supplement, the higher the higher the growth of hair. Just say something like that. Okay, so the more time we use the supplement, the hair growth is the higher the hair growth. Okay. So basically something like that. Okay. So that's the answer for the first question. I'm not going to write that, so it's simple as that. Question number 2, the average temperature and rainfall were collected for a number of cities around the world. The scatter diagram shows this information. So they have collected the average rainfall according to the average temperature. Okay, so the average temperature is our control, the independent variable, and the average rainfall is our response. Okay, so describe the correlation between average temperature and rainfall. Guys, when you look at this, is it possible to actually see a pattern? Because you can see over here, it starts from up here, goes up, and then comes down and goes up, comes down, and again over here, it has again come down. There is absolutely no way to get a straight line, right, guys? Because you can't just consider this. You can't just consider this because there's a point that comes down here, there's a point that comes up here. So definitely it doesn't work like that. Right, guys? So what does this tell you? It tells you that there is definitely what? There is no correlation because you can see one point it is up, another point it's down, and it's changing so rapidly. There's no way that this goes through a linear. What do you say? You can't say it goes. It has a relationship, a linear relationship. Then you have to say here there is no correlation. Right, guys? There's no correlation. Then there's a comment on the claim that hotter cities have less rainfall. Okay, so what do you have to say about this? So guys, over here, we just concluded that there is no relationship, right guys? If there is no relationship, so this is they are claiming on a relationship. Hotter cities have more less rainfall is a relationship, right? I do you get what I'm trying to say? So they say hotter cities have less rainfall means we are trying to say there is a pattern. But is there a pattern here? Is there any sort of a trend? There is no trend here, right? So there is no such thing. You can't be relying on this information because this information doesn't follow a core. It does not have a correlation. There's no correlation means there's no relationship. So there's no relationship means you can't give any claim. Okay, so you need to say basically your scatter plot. You can say there is no correlation. Therefore, the scatter plot will not it does not suggest that the hotter cities have less rainfall. You cannot give such a claim. Okay, because there is no correlation. All right, guys.